This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. It's starting to get hot again, mid-January in the southern hemisphere. This is flyer number 322, entitled My Masculist Annoyance with Turd Flinging Monkeys, that's TFM's, non-solution to the feminist-generated population crash. Description. This flyer strongly disagrees with TFM's non-solution to the feminist-generated population crash, that is, by stripping women of their rights and pushing them back into the housewife role to have more babies. This is just a return to the old man-slavery role for men, so as hotly opposed by the masculists, who aim to free men worldwide from man-slavery by forcing women to fip up or to rot on the shelf, totally ignored and punished by men. There are other, smarter ways to solve the longer-term population crash problem that this flyer discusses. The flyer itself. My Masculist Annoyance with Turd Flinging Monkeys, that's TFM's, non-solution to the feminist-generated population crash, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. The last few months, TFM, that's Turd Flinging Monkey, one of the most prominent and one of the most thoughtful of the MGTOWs on the internet, keeps harping on his solution to the feminist-generated population crash. Before commenting on it at length, I will state what the problem is and how he plans to solve it. I will then argue strongly against his non-solution and give alternative solutions based on masculist ideas. What is the problem? TFM argues that giving women rights, particularly the right to vote, was one of the biggest mistakes men ever made, because women used this voting right to create women's rights, fault-free divorce, equal rights for women in the workplace, the MARA, that's maternity rejection right, aka, also known as abortion right, that is the right to reject an unwanted pregnancy that men don't yet have the equivalent of. Hundreds of millions of women in the Western countries have now have careers, and choose to have often 0 or 1 kid, thus lowering the birth rate, and in time will cause the high IQ white cultures to die out due to the lack of children. In some advanced economies now, the birth rate is as low as 1.3 children born to each woman, whereas the replacement rate is 2.1. So at this rate, in a mere handful of generations, our Western populations will be decimated. Thus, in TFM's view, the root cause of the population crash is feminism, that is, women's rights. In his view, taking away women's rights and pushing them back into the home, back into the housewife role that women had in the 50s, will cause women to have more babies, because that would be the main focus of their lives, thus restoring the birth rate and preventing whole cultures from being wiped out, population-wise. TFM thinks that this solution might seem drastic, but feels it is necessary, since giving women careers causes the birth rate to plummet, as women choose their careers over being mothers, and that in the longer term is catastrophic, because it causes whole populations to die off due to lack of babies. Now, what do the masculists think about the population crash? Firstly, there's no denying that the population is crashing. Most advanced countries, especially the developed ones, Europe, US, etc., have low birth rates, typically in the range 1.5 or so. So simple math predicts that in a century or two, there'll be no more Westerners. Japan and Korea, both high IQ cultures, with advanced economies have birth rates as low as 1.3 and 1.4, which is catastrophic if sustained. So what do the masculists propose to overcome this problem? Several things. Firstly, a low birth rate is not such a bad thing for a few generations, because there's another horrible problem that the world is becoming increasingly conscious of, and that is global warming. There are way too many people in the world. If, for example, the rate of car possession that currently exists in the US becomes the norm for the whole planet, there'll be so much CO2 emitted into the atmosphere that the Earth's temperature will rise several degrees centigrade, so that the Earth's polar ice caps melt, raising the sea levels, so that many major coastal cities, for example London, New York, etc., get drowned. So, a major problem. Personally, I agree with the Jewish Illuminati's view that the world population should be under about 500 million. That is, as laid out in the famous Georgia Guidestones. Google it. To achieve this 15 times reduction in the world population, women's careerism and the impact of MGTOW on the birth rate need to be sustained for several generations. So in a manner of speaking, you could say that MGTOW is the solution to the global warming problem. If I were a global politician and thinking about the population crash, I would probably advocate more of the status quo, so that women continue in their careers and the MGTOW continue to boycott marriage and paternity. Thus, over several generations, the population does reduce to about 500 million. Actually, I'm not fully convinced yet that global warming is a net, so on balance, catastrophe, because there may be some strong benefits as well, which is a topic one does not hear much about. For example, if the polar ice caps melt and the sea level rises and major coastal cities like London, New York, etc. are flooded, then that is obviously a catastrophe. But on the other hand, there are currently huge tracts of land on the planet that are too cold and ice-ridden to be humanly habitable. For example, northern Canada, Russia's Siberia, the South Pole, etc. If the Earth warms enough for the Russian permafrost to melt, and a lot of trapped methane enters the atmosphere, then global warming will accelerate, thus warming up these huge tracts of land and perhaps making them more habitable by humans. But sooner or later, the human population needs to come down a lot. Otherwise, we may end up in a runaway global warming effect that could hurt everyone, even those living in the newly warmed areas that were previously uninhabitable. So, after a few generations, TFM's problem needs to be addressed. That is, that the population collapse needs to be stopped. So how to do that? As a masculist, I certainly don't agree with TFM's solution, or rather non-solution, of stripping women of their rights and pushing them back to the home. Because if women do that, how do they eat? Where do they get the money to buy food if they have no careers, no jobs, no source of income? Implicit in TFM's non-solution is the idea that men will pay for these women. Yet one of the fundamental goals of the masculists, in brackets, even featured in the very subtitle of my book on masculism, quote, "Masculism, men's rebellion against being man-slaves to women," end quote, is to free men from manslavery by forcing women to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, financially independent persons, which seems to be the very opposite of what TFM wants. But couldn't you argue, TFM style, that the masculist pushing of women to FIP up will only exacerbate the population crash problem, because then more women would become career-oriented and hence choose to have even fewer kids? I'll come to that a bit later. I wonder if TFM has looked at the number of years in a typical woman's life that she is a mother of small kids. Thanks to male-invented modern medicine, women will soon have a life expectancy into the 90s, so have a potential career window of about half a century. So under TFM's regime, men would have to pay for women for half a century, while these women are parasitic of the money of men. So implicitly, TFM is saying that men have to be man-slaves again for women in order to restore a replacement rate population. As a masculist, I hotly oppose a return to manslavery and put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up. or be punished by men by being totally ignored, not even being pumped and dumped. So contemptuous are masculists of fluffy parasite women. So how to have the best of both worlds, so that men are freed from man's slavery by having women be FIPs who are socialised by parents and educated by teachers to be FIPs, while on the other hand ensuring by various means that the population does not fall to alarming levels? One immediate measure to be taken is the men-fairing of the gender laws. Otherwise, the growth of MGTOW will move from the already high proportion of about 2/3 of young men under 35 in many Western countries to over 90% in probably less than a decade, so that the population drops to 1/10 of its current value, at least in Western countries. So the masculists need to push the public very hard that the gender laws need to be men-faired, so that divorce is no longer the toxic disaster for men that it currently is, so that men will be more prepared to be fathers again. One effective way the masculists can do this is to threaten women with babylessness, a la MGTOW, unless they vote with men to men-fair the gender laws, men-fair the divorce courts, bring in the that's paternity rejection right, etc. Masculists need to push the creation of millions of female masculists who learn to hate the fluffy feminist hypocrites who have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for men that young quality men refuse to give women their sperm, thus forcing these young women into babylessness and huge existential stress. Another major factor that is well within the time frame of the next 2 generations, that is 50, 60 years, is the rise of the artificial womb, which is probably only a decade or so away. Once men can grow their own kids, many men will prefer to have kids on their own and hire a nanny to breastfeed them as infants, and then allow the primary schools, which are full of women, to give their children female role models. Governments can impose singles taxes on single men and women to pay for women to have babies in baby farms, where women are full-time mothers and paid for by the government. Many women would love to have such a deal. That is, they can raise lots of kids and be paid for by the government, and hence have financial security. These women could be given the sperm of more able males, thus producing a eugenics effect. Since women are hypergamous, they will like the idea that the fathers of their children are superior males with superior DNA that their kids inherit. But research shows that single moms make awful parents, with the statistics showing that single mom children are much more likely to suffer from a slew of social maladjustments. For example, alcoholism, violent crime, teenage pregnancy, depression, vandalism, drug addiction, etc. So maybe governments could organise a fostering father scheme, where men who want to be fathers and who don't want to pay for a parasitic fluffy wife/mother under the traditional scheme. Fostering fathers could also be paid by the government to spend a number of hours per day/week with the children in his foster care. This way both boys and girls could be given male role models. Governments can promote some social engineering with slogans aimed at women, namely, quote, "Fip up and mother up," end quote. That is, become FIPs so as not to parasite off the money of a man and become adults, taking responsibility for their female lives, as well as having, quote, their 2 kids to replace their generation. To encourage women to have their 2 kids, the government and society in general could educate young women that they should structure their lives so that they get a career-competent education and have a career till they are about 27 to 30, then have their 2 kids until the second one is off to kindergarten. Then the mother goes back to work, perhaps part-time and gradually to full-time. Since women have a career window of half a century, women must work. The masculists will not tolerate that women sit on their parasitic bums for half a century, paid for by men. Men will all go MGTOW if that is the role expected of them. To spell out this half-century of career window, consider the following timeline of a typical woman's life. Assume she has a life expectancy of 90 years, which is coming soon. She has 2 kids, so she is off work for 7 years. That is, until The second one is at kindergarten. Assume she goes to university, a 4-year course, so graduates at age 22, works at her career for 5 years, which makes her 27, has 2 kids who go to kindergarten by the time she's 34, so she has another 56 years of life left. So if she retires at about 80 or so, then she has a career window of about half a century. Most certainly, now that women can work, as has just been shown, they must work. A major masculist slogan. TFM's non-solution is just that, because it demands man's slavery from men, so it's thrown out of court by the masculists. There are other ways to get the birth rate up after a few decades, to decrease the global population to a desired level of, for example, 500 million, to overcome the long-term global warming problem. TFM's non-solution seems to me to be extremely anti-masculist and frankly not very smart. There are better ways to solve our problems. Cheers, Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, contains links to 300 plus YouTube and Minds and BitChute. Masculist essays / videos, and to the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 300 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses.